Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I am Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of a state, Bud, that's doing something different, something special on the air. Bud, what's going on here in the state of Iowa?
I don't know about you, but I have fair fever.
Fair fever.
Like we said, kind of a bold move, marketing-wise, but I do like I'm repeating myself. I like the style.
Yeah, 4 years is enough.
I guess you could get a fever that wasn't pandemic related.
No, you just got like the one for more cowbell, for instance.
Are they saying something like catch the fever? That might be going a little too far.
Spread the fever. I just know it says fair fever. I think they're going for alliteration so they can be forgiven. But this is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. We are both here. I'm the senior advisor for mission initiatives down at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, what do you do at the non-state fairground?
I'm the dean of LAS. L stands for liberal, A for arts, and S for sciences. Put them all together. No, I'm supporting our faculty who teach those subjects.
Absolutely. So we, in some ways, our show is like the butter sculpture of the college, right, Bud? Like, people might be a little freaked out by us. Yeah. Some years are better than others, but if you don't have the Uncommon Good, if you don't have mission and you don't have the liberal arts, Bud, do you really have a college? It's just like the butter sculpture, really.
No, I mean, and it's an exciting time of year, not only the fair going on, but this time of year, you and I get to start to meet some of our new students. So it's always fun to see the newbies coming on board, sort of that first year excitement.
Absolutely. So we want to thank Mercy College for underwriting the show, mchs.edu. They're like, I'm trying to use fair metaphors and just doing a horrible job. They're like the macaroni and cheese with brisket on top of it, right? But like without that show, without the carbs and protein that you're likely to get from one of the fair food places, to have the energy to walk the 36 miles or whatever, you wouldn't have a good fair experience. Same thing, our show wouldn't be here without the support of Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I suppose here in the opening we should say the fair, we've been out there. We might, depending on when people are hearing this show, they may have seen us or they may also get to see us. But I think we should just make that plug for Iowa Catholic Radio. We have the Iowa Catholic Radio tent. It's in the same place. I think it's the same place it's always been. Has it ever been anywhere different since you and I have had the radio show?
No, it's always been there. And it's a great spot. It's the middle of the fairgrounds. There's usually...
By the Riley stage.
I know.
And Bill Riley? Isn't that their names?
I always say it wrong because I think of the cable show host, so I say Bill O'Reilly, and people are like, really?
No, I think it's the Ann and Bill Riley.
I like Bill Riley better than Bill O'Reilly.
It's the Riley stage.
You know what's funny is I'm not a huge fair guy. Like, I mean, there are some people where it's, fair bonkers. I love being there with Iowa Catholic Radio and meeting some of our listeners and, like praying with folks, repping the station. But I do, it's funny, I do like the fair aura.
Yeah.
So I have to say, like when I was driving to work this week, it really did feel different. There's just something about, it's almost like Christmas season in August for Iowa.
Yeah. Like
you can smell the corn dogs.
Well, people are sort of, when they're driving the wrong way down one-way roads, it's almost adorable. When they do this later during the wrestling and basketball tournaments and it's winter, you're like very angry. But something about it being summer, you're like, oh, head-on collisions.
That's right.
You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, as an introvert, sometimes the fair can be overwhelming with as many people as there are. I'm almost like, I can enjoy as much walking by the fairgrounds and hearing like the carnival music and kind of smelling like the spilled beer on the sidewalk the Cracker Jacks. Maybe
I don't know.
it's
a very carb centric smell.
So I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. What are we talking about on the show today, Bo?
I don't even know. Oh, history, right?
Yeah.
Well, I know people go, you talk about history all the time, but we'll get into why it was brought up. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Whether you're listening through the Iowa Catholic Radio airwaves, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, iowacatholicradio.com, or our wonderful podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. But I threw out that we were going to talk about history. That's maybe a little bit of a misnomer. What we're going to talk about is trying to thread together some of the concepts that get brought up on our show quite a bit. So we'll be honest about this. We'll eventually get to John Henry Newman. We'll eventually talk about McLuhan's understanding of mediums of communication. A lot of this gets about like the Bible and Jesus and faith and all these things like this. But what I'll say is I was asked because I mouthed off and said a quippy aphorism type thing that belongs on a T-shirt. And then someone said, "Can you explain what you mean?" And I got stuck. So I went into this, but I don't think there's anybody better to both check whether I'm just a big fat liar who doesn't know what they're talking about, or also to help me out than you, an actual person with, I don't know if we say this enough, but your PhD is in historical theology. So not only are you a theologian, but you know every bit of theology that's happened in history. That's what that means, right?
Whoa.
Can you maybe throw out what the good people at St. Louis University, under the comfortable shadow of the arch, why did they decide to grant you PhDs in historical theology instead of just theology?
Well, theologians like to break their field up into these different branches. So you can have something like systematic theology, which tries to take the truths of the faith and systematize them in an organized way. You know, there's more like practical theology. So it's like, what do the truths of the faith mean for how we live our lives, how we practice the faith and pastor others? My graduate studies was in historical theology. And you know what? It's funny that you posed that question because there's a lot of debate about what that precisely looks like. But in a nutshell, paying attention to the development of the faith across time. And you have to be careful how you say that because, of course, the truths revealed by God, they don't change. They don't transform into something different. But our understanding of them grows over time. The way that theologians talk about them can alter in ways that, so as Catholics, we're always seeking to safeguard, preserve, and pass down the truth, right? But taking a prominent example, so as Catholics, we affirm that our Lord is truly present in the Blessed Sacrament. At different times, theologians have talked about that in different ways. And so famously, St. Thomas Aquinas synthesized a series of arguments to talk about how at the Mass, the elements of bread and wine are transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. Well, that technical term, transubstantiation, is rooted in a whole history of philosophy. And this isn't being relativistic about language, but language has these nuances where you've talked about before, talking about coding with computer programmers is different than talking about that with emergency responders, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so it has these nuances, and historical theology kind of looks at the history of those arguments across time. In my own work, I looked at the life and writings of St. John Henry Newman and kind of investigated how even his ideas sort of developed as he had these different life experiences.
I think one way to put it is I get put on record as being anti-historical in a certain sense. There's a historicism that I'm often and truly do think that I'm fighting against. However, I think the best history, and that's what I hope that we end up talking about today, is precisely what you just got done explicating. What we're getting at is eternal truths are incarnate in particular places. So if we're going to say that humans are made of body and soul, right, and that the spiritual element within us is eternal, right, and so eternal truths don't change. However, because we are body and soul, those eternal truths exist in a material, incarnate way. And so even if you just talk about, truths that we can all say, you're only going to know them in the languages that are available to you. So if, you only know one language, English, but if you know multiple languages, you can even start to see this, right? That the truths are expressed a different way. This gets into like, well, what about math? That it doesn't matter what language you speak, but math in some way is its own language, right? And that's why it sort of is this international language.
Yeah. Et
cetera, et cetera. But of course, math, but if we're talking about Greek math versus calculus versus et cetera, et cetera. And I know, for instance, in your work, a lot of these questions start to say, well, where is, to situate John Henry Newman's incarnate life in a particular area and place and time, which is not to say that history is like the way that we're really going to solve the problems of theology because we're just going to figure out the events as they actually happened. But it gets to this idea that we believe in the incarnate word. We believe in incarnate truth. So let's take the carne seriously, right? What was enfleshed when some of these arguments were going on? We might not have, as it were, a neutral, secret path back to understanding what the Greek word homoousion must have meant before the Christians started to use it for, arguments about the Trinity. But certainly if we can do our best to ask what that word was before it, went into the transformation within the church, maybe we would have a better perspective of what was going on. Okay. Yeah. So what I like to argue and what I said was, I think it's important, especially for young people, to learn to do history rather than just read it. And like I said, I was being pithy there. Now, before we dig into that, A, do you think that sounds stupid, Bud? And B, what do you think? Does that resonate with you about the sort of arguments you had when you were doing historical theology and what does it mean to do different types of history maybe?
Yeah. So with some of those last comments that you were making, it reminded me of a quote of a mid-20th century theologian that I recently stumbled across. And he interestingly said, truth is no less truth for being a daughter of time. And because sometimes it almost gets back to like what we're willing to ascribe certainty to. Like, how can I be certain that this is a true statement? And we do, I think, because we live in a culture that really values like science in some ways. I mean, that's a complicated conversation.
Loaded
too.
word.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what was said. Yep.
It's sort of like if truth takes on like a syllogistic form, or if it's observable. Or in religion, like, is it something that like almost like the voice of God spoke? But even like from a very orthodox perspective, I think it's fair to say that Christians have a progressive understanding of revelation, meaning like scripture itself shows it lays out this whole history, and the key figures in that history, they were learning more about God as time went on. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that kind of challenges our ideas. Like if God had just dropped like a catechism with like 50 propositional statements from the sky, would that be able to mediate truth better to us than salvation history? I would say no. There was something like fitting and important that God prefigured that he was sending his son, but that the whole history of Israel led up to this incarnation. And we can only like, we have a better picture of who Jesus Christ is once we know that history.
I like that a lot because that's exactly what I was going to get at is history understood as an inert thing that we go back and find out about is what I'm against. And that's what I mean by just reading history. I mean, of course, I'm being colloquial, but this idea that like, oh, all you got to do is figure out how to access history. And once you do, it's very obvious. And then you can like prove or disprove things or know what you're going to believe. So on one hand, I think it's very Christian, and the reason that history has developed to what it has in the West, and let's be honest, in the West, under some people's guidance, I mean, Hegel, Marx, some of the big sort of modern philosophical names, history is like this seemingly living, breathing being that has its own existence, right? And can, cause human affairs to do X, Y, and Z. We don't have to go that far to say there's something dynamic about history for Christians that I think has influenced the West anywhere you find Christianity, even in people who aren't Christian that have to, so to speak, deal with us. And I think Judaism is the same way. I actually think Islam is the same way. There's this idea that as we go along, the past doesn't completely disappear, and we're able to sort of see it bloom, right? Or maybe like we peel back layers. I mean, there's a lot of metaphors you can use, some better than others. But there's this idea that the past keeps speaking to us and that we have an actual relationship with it that we can get better at. And Christianity, that is part and parcel of the faith, is that God was revealing things slowly through time so that in the fullness of time, truths that people weren't ready for beforehand now are ready and primed and they can be learned. And so for me, what I argue is anything that acts like history is, like I said, this inert thing that if we just go back and dig far enough, we'll find it and that will solve things, which to be honest was sort of the dominant idea of biblical historiography in the 1800s, right? That I'm very much against. And I think that we do that too often with kids, particularly. Yeah. Like we're so worried that if we don't make it easy or we don't tell them the history we want them to know, then like they're going to be easily, leaves floating in the wind. And we give this very brittle understanding of history that's easy to break apart. So we don't teach them that history is itself like traditions of contention, right? There's various communities that have arguments about what actually historically happened. But actually, if you go back to classical history, Bud, and you and I, me particular, we've taught or been a part of conversations about the classical curriculums, great books, and things like this. What does it mean to do history in a classical way? Mm-hmm. And what I want to argue is definitively with the Greeks and Romans, but specifically with Christians, history is never just a matter of retelling facts. And you go back to like Aristotle, he thinks that's the least interesting part of human life. He'll even say that poetry is closer to philosophy because it gets at like the eternal things that don't change, whereas what's normally called history, lowercase h, is just the passing random arrangement of material. However, what you start to see is this argument about history is an argument about witnesses and eyewitness accounts and who you're going to, so to speak, assent to believing what they say. And when you start to do this, right, and this gets into the sort of mediums of communication, when you stop acting like what history is this thing that goes into a book, and if you just find the right books, you can find the right, proof, even though people can write various accounts. The question starts to be, who witnessed what, and why do we give them the veracity of the account? So you have to do history. And to me, the earlier you start this with kids, where you go, you have to listen to accounts and then decide if you believe that person either as a direct witness, a witness of a witness, or a collator of witnesses, whether you believe their take on the account they heard. And if you go back in the past, Bud, like the ancient past, into late antiquity and certainly into the Middle Ages, that's all history could be. Yeah. But I think that when we start to get this false sense of the assurity of like documentary evidence that supposedly the modern world can give, we lose this dynamic understanding of history, this fact that you personally have to be involved in it and communities have to wrestle with these things, that Christians start to seem like they're saying stuff that they're actually not. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, so, we'll get at this like, oh, if you just look at you only believe the Bible because it's the authority in your life and you just say yes to it. Never mind that if you just talk about archaeological evidence of the first century, Jesus is an incredibly attested to figure, for instance. Mm-hmm. But we get this idea of like, oh, well, you just choose authorities and that's who you always chose. And it's just because your mom and dad believed it, so you do as well. I actually think where this gets into John Henry Newman, and maybe we're jumping the gun, we need to comment on the things I just got done saying. Yeah. But this gets into his book, The Grammar of Assent, and what it means to assent to things rather than acting like they're just propositional, inert forces that you either, have seen or not. With all of that said, and me droning on for a long time, do you get this sense with all of your studies that there has to be this dynamic doing of history and that maybe that gets washed over with our sort of overconfidence in our modern methods?
Yeah, whenever I follow up with a comment, I'm a little worried that I'm going to like knock it off the track that you're trying to follow. But like what I'm hearing and thinking about is, the study of history is one of those fields that's especially prone to overemphasizing the memorization of facts. And memorization is sort of a lost art. I do think it's really significant for education and for like a good education. But like the idea, like, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that if you just had someone learn enough of those, they'd have it like captured, their mind wrapped around it. But when you're talking about doing history, honestly, where I started to go was the sacraments. So like when we talk about remembering in the church, the technical term there is anamnesis. And the way this operates in scripture and salvation history is that when Israel participates in like the people of Israel in the prefiguration of the sacraments, and then the church today, it's not simply remembering something by calling it to mind, but that in some way you're kind of like mystically transported to those events. And so like when Moses recites the history of the Exodus to the people who are about to enter the promised land, he said, the Lord has done these things before your very eyes. Well, none of the people listening to him were alive. Well, how's that work out? Yeah, because they're waiting for the whole generation to die.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they weren't there to witness them like their parents had been, yet it's like God had done these things before your very eyes. I'll tell you the pushback, though. When we talked about these things, even like in historical theology at like St. Louis University, there's this real fear that if you approach history in those terms, it's not going to be objective.
Yeah.
But I'll let you jump in here, but real quick, I think about this even with the Gospels. So you'll hear critics of the Gospels, or even those who say like, I'm going to do historical critical work on the New Testament. They sort of like doubt, they question like we need another interpretive lens because the disciples had a vested interest in how they told the story.
Yep.
But compare this with like the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. There's, sorry to just like jump to Lincoln, but yeah, there's this.
Whatever, Oliver Stone.
There's this way where like if you did a police report and you say like the man was this tall, he walked into the theater this time of day, he used this type of gun, that tells you something about the event. But actually, if you read a historical...
Yeah, it's not history.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
If you read like a historical account that got into the Civil War and the entire background and why John Wilkes Booth first got so enraged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you're actually having a fuller account, like someone has a better in-depth understanding of history. And then to like walk through that event and to go to the site and to like touch the quote-unquote relics of what took place, right?
I mean, even to read opposite arguments, right? Yeah. And I mean, I think that's what you're getting at is they're worried that the Southerner and the Northerner are going to tell different histories. And like, isn't that, but you're like, of course they are. Mm-hmm. So how are we going to, as humans, approach the history except to admit that, and Bud, what's crazy is like, as you go along, doing history is also admitting that someone 100 years after that point might have very different reasons to tell different stories. That's not relativism, nor is it like you're saying unobjectivity. I don't understand what they think humans do except contend what these events mean.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of tensions there. I think in some ways, like some people don't want history to be like something that's contested, but it's sort of funny that in biblical studies, it's like we think someone, and I'm going to open up a can of worms and hopefully we can address it maybe in the second half of the show, that I'm here writing in the year 2000, let's say like 22, a couple of years ago, like wrapping up a book or something. And I somehow have this like special knowledge that the eyewitness didn't have. Yep. And the reason that we sort of approach it in those terms is because we say like, well, they had ideas about the cosmos or supernatural events that like they were mistaken. And so we have this kind of like elevated standpoint within which we can kind of like mark out their errors. I don't know if you're going to get to this. I mean,
yeah.
Because like what we've been kind of doing on the show this summer is like Bo kind of like surprises me with an idea and we see where it leads. And we feel like a lot of times it leads to some interesting conversation. But you have historical scholars today. I would say like N.T. Wright. I may be more of an N.T. Wright fan than Bo is, but like Marcus Bachmuel, where they look at the evidence even on the basis of the terms like the sort of like standards of judgment of like the most critical scholars, and they say like, if we look at this, like what's the best account we can give for what happened? And so, you know, like historically, the Gospel of John was seen as a gospel that was like really like theologically overladen. We don't have time right now to get into like Bachmuel's interesting arguments. In that case, it's actually a guy named Richard Bauckham.
Well, they're both good at it.
Yeah. So, but he says like, if we look at the evidence that's presented and he points to all these details and nuances in the text, that's probably like an eyewitness that wrote these accounts.
Yeah.
So he's got like the eyewitnesses in the Gospel of John or whatever. And so, yeah, that's a whole interesting conversation.
Yeah. And so that's exactly where I want to go next. I want to talk about this idea too about memory, and that memory is a practice that we have to keep up. It's not just a faculty. It's something that we do together. And part of the reason we keep looking into history is, so to speak, to exercise that spiritual muscle of memory, as it were. But this is the Uncommon Good. We'll be talking about all of this. More to come right after this.
Well, we'll be talking about all of this. More to come right after this.
More to come. 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 More back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We are, I should blame myself, being silly enough to say there's a difference between reading history and doing history. And maybe that's a nice t-shirt, but Bo, what on earth are you talking about? The idea in general is that history is not just this inert mass that if you go find the way to mine it, dig into it or whatever, you can see the history and disprove what's going on. But at the same time, we're not in any way saying that that means history is just completely relative. It's just your interpretation. We're also not saying, I should make this clear, that it's not that as we go through history, maybe because we have things like scientific apparatus that we can use, that we might not, it's actually true. Yes, we might be able to discover or clear up arguments about history that we couldn't beforehand. But certainly history is something that has to be done, and it's related to the faculty of memory and the sort of communal way that we remember. History has to be, as it were, contested in some ways, or at least it's the interaction of rival interpretations of events. But as you were leaving off, two people I have in mind particularly, it shows that we read each other's minds because you were guessing, but it's exactly what I had in mind. Marcus Bachmuel and Richard Bachman, two Protestant biblical scholars who I think do fantastic work. And, you know, what they're getting at is this is where I was talking about the McLuhan media study stuff. My argument is not that because of the printing press, we've forgotten to do history. What I'm trying to say is that the printing press and sort of the scientific achievements that follow from it that are then used for the study of history, they do some things really great. In fact, some things, Bud, that like we probably never were able to do in the past or do very little. But that also includes stuff that I think cultures formed more in an oral context or even a scribal one, where the idea is like, sure, you write things down, but the impression is you're always going to read and proclaim them. This is why we have sermons in a certain way, is sermons where I think were first made less to sort of, you know, inform about the propositions of the faith, although there were catechetical sermons, I'm not denying that. But just the proclamation of history, you were saying this with Moses, just to say this happened to us and our forebears was to make that reality re-present, to remember it. Like you said, the Eucharist, right? The Eucharist is doing history, right? It's making it present once again. Why it's important to look at like someone like Bachmuel and Bachman is, on one hand, they talk about the importance of eyewitnesses in ancient history, not just Christianity, but that's what part of doing history is assenting to witnesses. And why should you give your assent to this witness over another one? But another one they talk about, Bud, is living memory. This idea that is starting to pick up, I think a lot of more and more people in the history community admit this, that there's a sort of living memory where someone experiences an event, that person passes it down to their child, and then that person passes it down to that child and says, your granddad lived through this. And there's a way in which that 80 to 100 years lives in the memory of people in a way that other events don't. And so if you start to think about this, Bud, I don't know with our kids, but certainly I think what we are is sort of the last part of the living memory about, for instance, World War II in a way that we aren't about World War I. So like we heard stories from our grandparents talking about World War II where we go, oh my goodness, that really happened to them. And so then when we go read books and stuff like this, we sort of attach it to a personal element in our life. But our children aren't going to get that because they didn't live coterminously, or very little, I should say, with groups of people that went through World War II. So World War II, the living memory of it really sort of dies out with us. And so when you start to look, for instance, at events in the ancient past, they're going to throw out that it's not perfect, and of course people have vested interest, but there's something about the witnesses or the witnesses of the witnesses or the witnesses of the witnesses of the witnesses, that living memory has a special place. And to your point, like you were bringing this up with the gospel writers, there's even, you know, the immediacy of a Mark, which I think those two would grant that Mark was probably written sooner than maybe some people would say. But even let's say it gets into writing in like the 60s or the 70s, the sort of immediacy of a sort of oral tradition becomes apparent. John is written later, presumably by the Apostle John, who was old and wrote later. But, but what maybe is lost in immediacy, perspective is gained, but he's still an eyewitness with a living memory. And then you think about the patristics, Bud, who were writing under people who had witnessed those events. And all of a sudden, history stops being this like fleeting thing that we have like no real access to, and it's going to take, archaeological historical scientists in the long forward future to really resolve all these things. We start to see this way in which memory is a living thing that people do in the immediate aftermath, and that we continually do when there's these stories that are important to us.
Well, I like the comment that you made in the first half of the show, I believe, about muscle memory. Is it memory muscle or muscle memory? I think muscle memory.
Muscle memory.
How your memory is almost like this muscle that you have to exercise. But we sometimes think about that in very individualistic terms. And so we think about like preserving a memory well as like a lone individual sort of like keeping their mind sharp. But like some of the most, again, these terms get a little like slippery, but like accurate accounts of the past are when memory is informed in a communal way. And so if you have a family like who loves to tell stories, or you think about like your life as a church community, really as a community, what you're doing is preserving the most important memories across time. Like we all think about, like there are things that I remember about my own life that if it had been up to me and you had let me just like go about my business, I probably would have forgotten.
Absolutely.
But my siblings kept telling the stories like, oh yeah, remember when Bud did that crazy thing or whatever. There might be artifacts like Polaroid pictures. Yes, like I'm old enough for that to be a key part of my culture. And so like there's this kind of like muscle memory that builds up over time that's not sort of like downloaded into my brain, but is like a communal experience and narrative. And that's where I think when you talk about media and mediums, the printing press, like whatever we gain by it, and like I'm a bibliophile. I love reading and collecting books. There was a real loss because oral cultures did have a sort of muscle memory that's pretty much completely flaccid for us now.
Well, I mean, and even more so, right? Because we go, oh, well, surely there's a documentary on that I can watch later. Or you brought up Polaroids. But think about the difference between having like the singular Polaroid from an event and the fact now with your phone, you can take like 450 photos. And I always joke around with my family as like, well, we only like taking one picture because then no one could say your story's incorrect, which is what historians I think are like really worried about. Yeah. But there's a way in which we give our memories a break because like, well, I took all those pictures. But I got to say, what wisdom is lost, I think, is not so much like these evil machines, how dare they? But it is certainly the case that we forget that pictures or movies or books, they're for the sake of memory later. In some ways, Bud, reading a book is great, like if you want to do that, but if it's not, I'm not saying for a book club, but if you're never thinking like, I will make this a part of some story, whether it's a story at my job, an academic story, or just a story at a book club or among friends, there's a way in which you're not doing history until you go, this will come up in a story, even if not directly, even if it's sort of just an inference. If I think it's just a memory that I put in the memory bank and I can win Jeopardy at some point, then we're not doing history. And that's what I'm trying to say with the little statement.
It's sort of a challenge to us as parents and leaders of communities and things where, so in the film, The Passion of the Christ, like I have two scenes that I really like. One is the opening scene where Satan tempts our Lord in the garden. The second one is there's this moment where, I think John, I really love this scene so much that I've forgotten it. But at the Passover meal, every Passover, when the family comes to celebrate the meal, I think it's usually a son will ask the father, why is this night different than every other?
Yeah.
And then they recite about how God brought his people out of Egypt. And this question is posed in the film, and I think it's posed to Mary, and then it cuts to our Lord and his passion. And I guess in that moment, Gibson really captured well, like he kind of claps his time where you see the Passover history and the background of what's taking place, you recognize Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And then you realize that for all these years to come, like as the film goers, like we kind of realize that in the intervening years between when these events took place and when we were watching the movie, that the people, like the Jewish people, continue to ask that question. But then as Christians, we were incorporated in that history, and we see the Passover in a new and different light, but there's something continuous about what God was doing in Egypt, in first century Palestine, and then in our own lives. And so when I say it's a challenge to us, like when you talk about doing history, we have to find ways as parents, as educators, as parish communities to practice, to like strengthen that muscle memory through the right kinds of practices.
Absolutely. And I think part of it is, religious ritual is this. You go back to memorization. I think that that's a great way to make this point. Largely, we do similar things, right? Like history's not greatly changed. But for instance, memorization, rote memorization. You know, the reason you do that is so you easily call it to mind without having to go look it back up. Mm-hmm. So it's not the matter of like, you need to learn 1492, Columbus sighted the ocean blue, unless like you're going to be at a place where you're not going to have books or phones handy and you need to like talk about that. But that's why we say, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, right? Or like more pertinently, right? I believe in Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit. Like that's history. Mm-hmm. And we're saying it and we're remembering it by saying it together. And we memorize it because it's important to not, to be able to say that together. The Hail Mary in many ways is like a history prayer where we say, this is what happened to Mary. And now we're asking for her invocation. I think it's a similar way where, people are like, oh, that's not history, that's hagiography. And I understand this idea that, you go read something like the Golden Legend from the Middle Ages, and certainly there's some crazy, freaky stuff that supposedly the saints did. Okay, fine. Mm-hmm. I understand how it can get out of control. But I think what people misunderstand about, for instance, like common tropes in history, they'll say, well, there's no way, because you'll get like 4 or 5 saints, and it will be like, let's just say, 1st through 3rd century female virgins that were killed by Roman emperors. And people will go like, oh, well, these tales are basically the same. Well, what I think people forget is that if you're a peasant and you want to remember something, the most real part of history is when eternity touches time. So if there's these patterns that keep coming up, partly for memorization purposes, but partly to show that it's important, you start to match the oral story you tell about someone you personally know and their details by placing their life, so to speak, in the well-worn grooves of these tropes. Now, we say, oh my gosh, they're lying or they're trying to like trump up business or whatever. But I actually think it's like, okay, well, we're going to remember St. Agnes because she belongs to the, virgin who refused, the call of men in order to die, a virgin bride of Christ trope. And I use that with quotation marks because I actually believe all that happened. But the point that I'm getting at is if they start to conform to each other, it's the people's way of saying, well, this is how we're going to remember this particular person. And what you'll start to see is things that sort of have, like I said, a groove. They have like a sort of well-known bios, right? Like their lives like maybe start to seem somewhat alike, but they usually have something thrown in there that's very personal and distinct, right? I actually would think about this because the Feast of the Transfiguration just occurred. Yeah. And Bud, not only do we have a weird, like all 3 of the synoptics attest to it, and Peter himself writes about it in the letter, which in the ancient world, this is like a lot of attestation. Yeah. But Bud, what I think is interesting is in all 3 of the synoptic gospels, Peter fumbling around and like saying, let's build tents. It shows up in all of them. And that to me starts to show you, right, this way in which you were talking about like your siblings telling jokes about when you did something silly or stupid or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you know what? When we tell our funny stories in our lives to each other, they can maybe start to sound like the comedy movies we're used to, or like this is how people in this region talk. But do you notice that there's always like one thing we pick out and go, but that's the thing that made it Bud doing this time. And so doing history is that sort of stuff, memorizing what we need to, running into facts, but like they're for the sake of telling the story, of hearing stories that don't agree with ours and navigating and negotiating which witnesses that we're going to give our assent to, which here at the end, Bud, again, there's no way to quickly sum up the grammar of assent. But if to use your Newman expertise, can you just real quickly talk about like what he means when he talks about assent or the illative sense, how you see this plays into what it means to do history?
Well, if you're going to jump into Newman's writings, I wouldn't start with the grammar of assent. It's probably the heaviest sledding of any book that he wrote. And Newman was really wrestling with questions about how we know what we know, and really kind of like human nature and the understanding of the human mind. Kind of like in terms of a payoff, like a real sort of like idea that you can grab a hold of as we talk about these topics is Newman contrasted real assent with notional assent. And a notional understanding of something is kind of like what we gain through inference. What I mean by that is like an idea is presented to you and your mind goes through a process of reasoning in which it truly understands the idea, but it's still at like what Newman calls a notional level. So in a lot of ways, the way that institutions teach theology these days can be along those lines. It's kind of like you look at the history of theology and you learn the terminology and you understand sort of like philosophically how it was operating in this discourse. Real assent is something different. It maybe builds on notional assent, but there's this involvement of the person. So this is where, like, again, when you think about the Catholic faith, real assent would be along the lines of devotional practice, because with devotion, like when you think about the faithful, like practicing devotions, they're the ideas at work, but they've all of a sudden intersected with one's life in such a way that like it's not simply coming to understand what Christians believe about God, but it's believing it about oneself and, understanding the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as like a reality, Mary as a historical figure who was, central to the history of salvation and things like this. And then that transforms your heart and the very like shape of your life. That's a very like quick overview synopsis. And I'm sure like some Newmanists, if they're listening, might take issue with like, I wasn't really able to get into the nuts and bolts, but that's kind of like the 4,000 foot.
Yeah. So, and he brings up he talks about the illative sense, which again, why he says that and what that's opposed to is less important than, so this is like the intellectual counterpart to something I harangue on about, which is practical wisdom, phronesis. Practical wisdom is where the goals that you're trying to accomplish, where you're going, as it were. But practical wisdom is the sort of living ability to choose the next step in a chain of choices that will get you to your ultimate goal. And the illative sense is a similar thing where, as it were, the truth is the truth, but the illative sense understands over the practicalities of time, of things that you're running into, how you connect those together to get to the ultimate truth. And so if history is not this just standing inert mass that you dig through and then you're like, oh, I found the big chunk of history that proves the point, mostly what it is people remembering, telling the stories, and then you have to make illative sense of, like you were talking about inference, illative sense of what comes up and what you will give assent to, and there's not some sort of straight line, easy propositional way that if you just go A plus B minus C equals D and now I have the truth, it's like you said, there's these competing stories about what happened in history, and even if we agree on what happened, what does it mean? And the illative sense informs the intellect, but as you said, faith, of course, is of the will, and it's a gift, but intellectual faith is in many times driven on by this illative sense. And I think what Newman is trying to say is that's not, so to speak, some sort of inferior, servile belief that only Christians have. This is a majority, as it were, of the way that humans go through life assenting to truths that they themselves can't prove because they themselves are not like professional historians in this or that field.
Yeah, if you're the master of a craft, your illative sense will often be like very strong. Like Newman gives these examples that I think you can really grab a hold of. So he talks about like a physician who's a sick patient is brought to them, and all these tests have been run and different things like that. But like someone who has a lot of experience in the field, they'll sometimes look at a patient and like there's almost like this immediacy to the diagnosis that can't be boiled down just simply to sort of like reading the numbers. It's like someone who has this illative sense, this kind of like life experience, and sees all the factors and brings them together. Or like Newman doesn't talk about a meteorologist, like or weathermen, but he talks about farmers who they have this strong sense like a storm is coming, and if you ask them to break it down, they may give you like these reasons, like the sky is this color, or there's like a smell in the air or something like that. But they have this illative sense, and it's really trustworthy knowledge. Like in some ways today, I would almost like trust a seasoned farmer to tell me when a storm was coming than like the weatherman on Channel 3 or whatever. I don't know who's actually on Channel 3. But that's this illative sense. And what you're saying, Bo, is like in our doing of history and our understanding of history, as we strengthen that muscle memory, like we can develop that illative sense to know which witnesses to trust.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good way to finish up what we're talking about here. Certainly the weathermen who have all of the instrumentation have an advantage for doing like long-term predictions that a farmer never could. And similarly, historians, because of the different tools of the trade, can make assessments, but of like long trends, and they can do stuff that could never happen with old historians. It's absolutely true. Material history particularly. However, doing history, and why we have students do it, because we're not thinking like we need to make a huge group of future scientific historians. No, what we do in like at classical schools in the classical sense is we do this public memory. We do this in order to give people an illative sense, strengthen that muscle memory so that they are able to, like you said, read the sign of the times and know what weather's going on. And even when they do come across Bud, like a weatherman back at the station, that they have the illative sense enough to know who should they trust and assent to. And I think that that's a good metaphor to end up on this. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, one more time, thank you for, as you pointed out, me throwing out a crazy idea. And just real quick, verdict-wise, that T-shirt that I am proposing to make, you shouldn't just read history, you should do history.
I like it. I'm filling out my T-shirt order form as we speak.
Bud, if people want to exercise that illative sense and call to mind the Christian pass through prayer here with us on Iowa Catholic Radio, what are ways they can do so?
Yeah, we do broadcast the Rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., the Chaplet of Divine Mercy in the afternoon at 2:55 p.m., but you can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
You can go to iowacatholicradio.com to check out all sorts of things, including events. But the really obvious one, just to point out to people, the Iowa State Fair. As we said, the Iowa Catholic Radio booth, same place, the Ann and Bill Riley stage. Bud and I will be there at certain times, other radio hosts, but make sure to go check that out. The other thing, of course, is the Christ Our Life Conference coming up in September. You can check out all of that at iowacatholicradio.com on the events page. But finally, one more plea just to say, this ministry is not just the people behind the mics, behind the boards or the desks. It is your ministry. You make it possible. We crave your prayers. We thank you for all of the volunteering you do. But we got to ask for those material help through donations. 515-223-1150 or email iowacatholicradio.com. Excuse me. Go to iowacatholicradio.com and hit the donate button. You could probably find people to email there as well. But in doing so, that is what makes this ministry possible. Thank you for everybody who donates. One more time, 515-223-1150 and iowacatholicradio.com. Bud, thanks for a wonderful show. Looking forward to seeing people out at the fair. Or if you already saw us, I hope we were polite and nice to you.
I try to be each year.
That's the goal we're shooting for. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, families, city, state, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.